Hi Reddit, my name's Madison. I'm 26 and apparently I've become the villain in my mother's latest fairy tale. At least that is how she and her soon to be husband have decided to frame things. For some background, my mom Sandra is 51. She and my dad Mark divorced about 10 years ago. When I was still in high school, I am the older child, and during that time, my dad and I became extremely close, largely because I ended up stepping into a role that most teenagers should never have to. While my mom was moving on with her life and focusing on my younger half brother Ethan, who is 18 now, I was the one helping my dad keep it together. I paid bills, cooked, organized his paperwork, and basically acted like a second parent instead of a child. My mom always had a soft spot for Ethan. He is the golden boy who has been handed excuse after excuse his entire life, and he has mastered the art of skating by without consequence. Meanwhile, I have always been treated as the responsible one who could handle anything. About a year ago, my mom started dating Greg, who is 54. He works in what he calls consulting, which from what I can tell is just a vague way of saying no one knows what he actually does. Greg has a daughter named Claire who is 21. She is one of those people who calls herself quirky because she owns a record player, even though she never actually buys records. She goes to college out of state, spends money like she thinks the credit card bill will never come due, and gives off that air of entitlement that comes from being bailed out one too many times. Now, I live in my own apartment. It is not glamorous, but it is mine. I work as an accountant. I budget like my life depends on it, and every single piece of furniture in that place has been bought with my own money. There's a second bedroom, but I use it as an office because I sometimes bring work home, and more importantly, because I value my privacy. A few months ago, Greg decided to approach me with what he thought was a brilliant idea. He said Claire would be graduating soon, and he wanted to know if I would let her live with me rent-free for a while. At first, I actually laughed because I assumed it was a bad joke, but then I realized he was completely serious when he said, "It's family now, you should help her out. She's had a rough time, and it would be selfish not to share your place." I looked at him and told him absolutely not. I work my butt off to afford my apartment, and I do not want a roommate, especially not one who treats money like Monopoly bills and has never shown an ounce of responsibility in her life. Apparently, that was the wrong answer. From that point forward, I could feel the shift in how Greg looked at me. Fast forward to about a month ago, my mom and Greg finally announced their wedding date. Everyone was buzzing about it. Ethan was pretending to care, and Claire was posting every detail online like she was the bride herself. Then, just a week after the announcement, Greg pulled me aside in that smug, quiet way of his. He lowered his voice as though he was doing me some kind of favor and said, "Don't come to the wedding unless you're going to share your apartment with Claire. We don't want negative energy that day." I was so stunned I thought I had misheard him. I stood there blinking, trying to process that this man was literally telling me I was unwelcome at my own mother's wedding unless I allowed his daughter to move into my home. But no, he was dead serious. I did not confront my mom right away because honestly, I did not want to believe it was real. I thought maybe I had misunderstood, or maybe he had spoken in the heat of the moment. But when I finally brought it up to her, she looked me in the eye and said, "Madison, you've always been independent. You can handle it. Claire just needs a little help getting on her feet." The translation was painfully clear. She was not going to defend me. My feelings, my boundaries, and my very valid reasons for saying no meant nothing compared to the comfort of her fiancé's daughter. That conversation hit me harder than I expected. It is one thing for Greg to try to manipulate me with ultimatums, but for my own mother to side with him and minimize everything I have built for myself was crushing. It felt like every year I spent being the responsible one, every late night helping my dad keep his life afloat, every sacrifice I made while Ethan was coddled and babied, all of it meant absolutely nothing to her. She only sees me as someone who can handle anything, which in her mind means I should be willing to handle everything. For the past few weeks, I have been stewing in a mix of anger and hurt. My friends keep telling me I am not crazy, that no one would tolerate an ultimatum like that. My dad told me he is proud of me for standing firm, and that meant more than I can explain. But the thing that keeps replaying in my head is Greg's smug little face when he told me not to bring my negative energy to their wedding. It is as if he thinks he has the power to dictate not only where I live and with whom, but also whether I have the right to celebrate my own mother's marriage. And the worst part is that my mom is letting him. I have realized that I cannot win in this situation. If I cave and let Claire move in, I will be miserable in my own home, working to pay for someone else's comfort while she racks up more debt and treats my space like a crash pad. If I refuse, I am branded as selfish and cold, the villain in their little family story. And if I try to argue with my mom, all I get in return is another speech about how independent I am and how Claire just needs a chance. So I decided, fine, if they don't want me at their wedding, they'll get exactly that. The wedding was supposed to be this big fancy garden party with about 150 guests, the kind where every little detail gets plastered all over social media and people pretend it is a fairy tale. My mom had been bragging for months about how beautiful it was going to be, with flowers flown in from out of state and a live string quartet and some celebrity chef caterer Greg swore he knew through connections. Every time she called me to talk about it, I just listened in silence because what was the point? I had already been told I was not welcome unless I let Claire move in with me, and I was not about to budge. The funny thing is, despite being cut out of everything, I still knew more about what was going on behind the scenes than most of the family. My dad and I are still close, and even though he and my mom split a decade ago, he still hears all the gossip through mutual friends. That is how I found out that Greg had not actually paid the venue in full. My mom had been under the impression that everything was covered because Greg liked to brag about how he had connections and how he was getting them a deal. But as it turned out, his idea of a deal was writing a check he could not cover and hoping no one would notice until after the event. Here is where it got interesting. Years ago, back in college, I did an internship with the accountant who worked for the owner of that exact venue. It is one of those connections you do not really think about until suddenly it becomes useful. When I heard through the grapevine that Greg might be over his head, I picked up the phone and called the owner. All I said was, "Hey, you might want to double check the payment status for the Simmons-Howard wedding." I did not embellish. I did not try to stir drama. I just nudged them toward the truth. The owner looked into it, and sure enough, the check Greg had written had bounced. Not delayed, not pending, flat out bounced. And because Greg had dragged his feet on fixing it, the owner decided he was not taking the risk. With only 2 weeks to go before the wedding, their contract was canceled. No venue, no fancy garden, no string quartet echoing over manicured hedges, just a hard reality check delivered right to their doorstep. When word got back to me, I heard that my mom was absolutely furious. She had been under the impression that Greg had everything handled, and suddenly she was left scrambling with her reputation on the line. Relatives had already booked hotels and flights expecting some glamorous event, and now it was all falling apart. Greg, from what I heard, went into full panic mode, calling in favors that did not exist and trying to spin the story so he did not look like the one who dropped the ball. But no matter what excuses he tried, the fact was simple. He had bragged his way into a hole he could not climb out of. With the venue gone, they had no choice but to downgrade. Instead of a sprawling garden wedding, they ended up booking a local community hall, the kind that still smells faintly like decades of bingo nights and high school graduations. Plastic folding chairs replaced the rented gold Chiavari chairs my mom had been gushing about, and instead of a catered feast from a celebrity chef, they were stuck with whatever local caterer could squeeze them in at the last minute. Guests who had been expecting an Instagram-worthy affair were instead treated to mismatched decorations and a sound system that screeched every time someone tapped the microphone. I was not invited back onto the guest list. My mother never picked up the phone to say, "You were right," or even to ask for my presence. I was still persona non grata because I would not bend to their ultimatum. But Relatives, they talked, they called me, texted me, whispered the details at family dinners. They were not amused at the downgrade. A few even said it was embarrassing to be there because of how obvious the contrast was between what had been promised and what was delivered. My invite never got reinstated, but I heard all about it from relatives who were not amused at the change. This is where it got funny. After the garden venue fiasco, my mom and Greg tried to spin the whole disaster like it was intentional. Instead of admitting they were backed into a corner, Greg started telling anyone who would listen that they never wanted some pretentious wedding anyway, that they were keeping it simple and authentic because that was more their style. The problem with this narrative was that everyone remembered my mom gushing for months about imported flowers and string quartets and celebrity catering, so the sudden pivot to folding chairs and fairy lights strung across a community hall looked less like authentic simplicity and more like desperate damage control. Still, they tried to carry on with the illusion, but even the scaled-down version of their event came with costs. And this time vendors were not willing to take Greg's word for it. When the new caterer asked for half the payment up front, Greg's bravado hit a wall. Apparently his accounts were stretched thin, and instead of owning up to it, he tried to push the responsibility onto my mom. I can only imagine the conversation, but knowing her, she probably went along with it because that's what she does. She bends to Greg and expects everyone else to do the same. The first I heard of it was when my phone buzzed with a text from her. It said, "Madison, family supports family. Can you help us out with the deposit?" I actually laughed out loud reading it because this was coming from the same woman who told me I wasn't welcome at her wedding unless I gave up my apartment to Claire. Suddenly, I was good enough to be family again as long as my wallet was involved. I typed back a response that felt like years of frustration packed into one sentence. Sure, as soon as Claire signs the lease for my apartment. Then I put my phone down and waited. The silence that followed was absolutely golden. No reply, no attempt at negotiation. Nothing but quiet, which told me everything I needed to know. They had pushed me aside, called me selfish, and then expected me to swoop in with money when their fantasy wedding started crumbling. And when I made it clear that wasn't happening, they had nowhere to turn. That is when the fallout started to get uglier. With no help from me and no miracle from Greg's so-called connections, they scrambled to scrape together enough cash to lock in the caterer. The solution they landed on was to dip into Ethan's college savings account, and not just a little dip. They drained it completely. The same account I had helped set up years ago by working weekends at Starbucks during college, carefully setting aside enough to give him a decent start when it was his turn to move forward. I remembered all those shifts where I came home smelling like burnt espresso, counting tips just to contribute a few hundred here and there. It wasn't much, but over the years it had added up, and it was supposed to be for him, not for my mother's second wedding to a man who could not balance a checkbook. I found out what happened when Ethan called me late one night. His voice was shaky and he was trying to hold it together, but I could tell he was breaking. He told me Mom had sat him down and said they needed to use the money for the family's future. He said she tried to spin it like it was some noble sacrifice, as if funding her party was a collective investment in everyone's happiness. But he wasn't buying it. He cried as he told me it felt like everything he had been promised was just gone in an instant. The savings that were supposed to ease the burden of tuition or books or even just moving out of the house had evaporated into bad catering and rented tablecloths. I listened, and it hurt to hear him like that. Despite how spoiled he has been over the years, Ethan is still my little brother, and I never wanted him to learn this kind of lesson the hard way. When he asked me what to do, I took a breath and told him the truth. I reminded him he could always apply for scholarships, and that maybe he should consider who's really looking out for him. The wedding day itself was chaos from the very beginning. By that point, the cracks in their perfect image were already obvious to everyone, but the way things unraveled in real time made it even worse. Guests had shown up dressed to the nines, expecting at least some kind of elegance despite the downgrade from the garden venue to the community hall. Instead, what they walked into looked more like a middle school dance than a wedding. Plastic chairs, dollar store streamers, mismatched centerpieces, and a faint smell of cleaning solution that clung to everything. Still, people tried to put on polite smiles. Families tend to do that, even when the discomfort is thick enough to choke on. My mom flitted around, pretending she was unbothered, while Greg strutted as though the room didn't reek of desperation. The guests were restless but kept their thoughts quiet, at least until the entertainment fell apart. The DJ, who had been booked weeks prior, never showed up. At first, they made excuses about traffic, but the truth was simpler. Greg had not paid him. Just like the venue, just like the caterer, it was another bill ignored, another promise broken. So instead of an actual DJ, someone dragged out a phone, hooked it up to a tiny Bluetooth speaker, and hit play on a Spotify playlist labeled Wedding Vibes. The sound barely carried past the first few tables, cutting in and out whenever someone walked too close to the device. Guests were whispering about it openly, some stifling laughter, others shaking their heads in disbelief. The ceremony itself was rushed, awkward, and felt more like a formality than anything heartfelt. And then came the speeches. Claire, of course, had to take the stage and soak in the attention. She grabbed the microphone with the confidence of someone who thrives on drama and began a rambling speech about how family is everything. She dragged out every cliche in the book, but the worst part was when she turned her head and glared directly at the empty chair that had been reserved for me. It was petty, it was deliberate, and apparently it was her way of making sure everyone knew who the villain in the story was supposed to be. From what I heard, the room went uncomfortably quiet because even those who didn't know the details realized the tension was thick enough to cut. But the true disaster came during the reception. People were just starting to eat when, out of nowhere, the power went out. Total blackout. The community hall was plunged into darkness, and the only light came from the glow of cell phone screens as guests pulled them out in confusion. The air conditioning shut off immediately, and because it was a hot day, the room started heating up fast. Guests fanned themselves with paper napkins, sweat beading on their foreheads, while the food on the table slowly went cold. It turned out Greg had never paid the utility fee in advance. The hall required it before large events, and he had brushed it off as unnecessary. So, the building simply shut down in the middle of their wedding. Guests sat in the sweltering dark, listening to the muffled complaints echo across the room. Some left early, muttering about wasted travel and ruined outfits, while others stayed only to gossip later about how the whole thing had been a train wreck. The only part of the night that felt remotely joyful for me came through my phone. My cousin, who has always been blunt, texted me mid-reception. The message lit up my screen with a single line that made me laugh until I cried. It said, "This is the funniest disaster I've ever seen. Wish you were here." A week after the infamous blackout wedding, I got the kind of phone call I knew was coming eventually, but still wasn't prepared for in the moment. My mom was crying, her voice shaking, and for the first time in years, she sounded like someone who had finally realized she had been living in a fantasy. She confessed that Greg had been lying about his finances from the very beginning. The so-called consulting job was nothing but smoke and mirrors, and in reality, he was drowning in debt. He had married her not out of love or partnership, but because he needed someone to shoulder the mess he had created. All of those boasts about connections, all of those checks that bounced, all of the corners cut, it was all because he didn't have the money to begin with. That was when the truth about Claire finally came out too. Greg's grand plan to push her into my apartment had nothing to do with giving her a chance at independence. It was because he literally could not afford to support her anymore. He wanted me to take on the responsibility he couldn't handle, and when I refused, he turned it into a moral failing on my part. My mom, through her tears, begged me to reconsider. She told me, "Please, Madison, just for a few months until we figure things out." Hearing her say it like that, as though my boundaries were just obstacles to be bargained with, made my stomach turn. I told her no. I said that I wasn't responsible for fixing her mistakes. I reminded her that she had chosen a man who valued me less than his own daughter and expected me to fall in line anyway. Though now she was learning who he really was, and it wasn't my job to clean up after her choices. The silence that followed was heavy, but it was the kind of silence that comes when the truth has finally been spoken out loud. That same evening, my dad and I went out for dinner. He had just gotten a promotion at work, and we wanted to celebrate it together. Sitting across from him, clinking glasses over a steak dinner, I felt a wave of calm settle over me. He looked at me and said, "You know, Madison, sometimes the best thing you can do for people is let them lie in the bed they made." And he was right. For the first time in this whole exhausting saga, I felt at peace. Meanwhile, life at my mom's house has become exactly what you would expect when a man with too much ego and too little money moves in with a woman who has spent years looking the other way. Greg and Claire are both living there now, crammed into a space that was never meant for that many people. Claire's boxes fill Ethan's bedroom, so he has been relegated to the couch in the living room. From what I've heard, he's miserable, and the resentment is building. My mom, who thought she was marrying into stability, is now supporting a grown man, his daughter, and managing the fallout of draining her son's college fund. And me, I'm in my own quiet apartment, debt-free, drama-free. My space is mine alone, and I fill it with peace instead of chaos. I spend my evenings sipping wine, scrolling through Reddit, and enjoying the fact that the circus is no longer my responsibility. The best part of it all is that every time I think about their wedding, the Spotify playlist, Claire's speech aimed at my empty chair, the blackout in the middle of dinner, I can't help but laugh. What was supposed to be a perfect fairy tale turned into a cautionary tale, and I didn't even have to lift a finger to make it happen. That's the end of this story, and honestly, I feel lighter just writing it all out. Thanks for sticking with me through this mess. If you enjoyed the ride, please give it a like, drop a comment, and don't forget to subscribe for more.